How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you. Today, I'm joined by a powerlifter, a weightlifter, and a physiotherapist. Today, I am joined by the one and only Jess, I hope I say this right, Sewastenko. How are you doing?
I'm great, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me. And you absolutely nailed that.
Oh, spot on. There we go. Nerves have all gone now.
Hardest part
How
of the podcast done.
um, how are you? What's been happening in your world? What have you been up to recently?
Yeah, I've been pretty good. Other than the crazy things going on in the world right now. And I think in Australia, we're battling, I guess not drowning. Everything's been pretty good. I guess recently for us, we've just we're on the verge of finding out with Commonwealth Games coming up what's happening. So things have been pretty busy, which is awesome. But yeah, otherwise everything's been great.
And what sort of the timings for the Commonwealth Games are finding everything else about that? Because I know I've actually got a client who recently went to Australia because your borders have recently just opened and that sort of stuff. What's kind of the process with that?
Yeah, so I guess with Com Games itself, we pretty much already have verdicts, but we've just got to wait for the official okay to have the team released. But yeah, everything's kind of happening. So all the qualifying competitions for weightlifting anyway are finalized and they're all done. So I think everyone either knows or doesn't know at this point, which is pretty cool. Even though we're still like 4 and a bit months out, so it's kind of weird to find out this early. But yeah, I think we're one of the first sports to actually have confirmation that people are going or not. So I think in terms of that, that's a lot of stress off people's shoulders to have another big qualifying event all sort of behind and now the big thing to come forward. But yeah, I think with borders and stuff, it definitely made all the competitions in the lead up a bit different. But I think everything's settling down a bit now.
Yeah, I know from watching, it must have been last year now, the first international competition that I watched for weightlifting was the Europeans. And it kind of went from people just competing locally to then, boom, right, you're on the international stage, again, which is, just to take into account the nerves that you would usually have for a competition and all those sorts of things, and then take into account traveling. It's probably a good thing that people know that early on, which is good. So obviously I did quite a brief introduction there. Obviously there's more to you than just the powerlifting, weightlifting and physio, but for anyone listening who might not know your background in training, in competing and getting into strength sports, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I'll keep it pretty short and sweet. And if we want to dive into anything specific, we can. But I've been competing in sport for like as long as I can remember. I've started off with, I think like most of us did in primary school, the old, either cross country running or swimming, one or the other. So I was a cross country runner back in primary school and went through, I did a lot of competitive karate for about 17 years. Through that, played a lot of football, football is in rugby league here, and a bit of rugby union. And then I found myself in strength sports at the back end of sort of where I would say my athletic career is now. And that's where I found my powerlifting and my weightlifting, which is where my heart's at now. So I think through as a kid, I've been super lucky to be exposed to so many different aspects of sport, individual, team, strength, endurance, you name it, which I think has attributed a lot to where I'm at today, this day and age. But yeah, definitely a big variety along the way.
Yeah, I think I always like to ask about the sports side of things and what have people done before powerlifting or weightlifting, because I find it, especially with the rugby league and rugby union, that's kind of my background as well. And then I ended up not playing as much rugby, sort of both codes, and then gravitated more towards the strength just to have something competitive, and with that, I remember always having an interest in strength. I remember, over here in the UK, I'm not sure if it's the same in Australia, having World's Strongest Man always on at Christmas, and you'd watch them and be like, I think that's pretty cool. Had you always had an interest in, well, there's actually a two-part to this one, so hopefully you can keep with me. Had you always had an interest in strength sports from doing karate and playing rugby? And sort of the second part of that is, do you think having played a variety of sports before getting into weightlifting and powerlifting was actually more of a benefit rather than, a lot of people now, because you can type in powerlifting on Instagram and you'll find loads of stuff. And people are maybe getting an entry point into powerlifting and weightlifting at maybe a younger age, rather than, some people gravitating towards it a little bit later after they've, dabbled in a couple of sports, if both of those make sense.
Yeah, 100%. I guess the first one about always wanting to do strength sports, I'd say no. Like, I think for me, when I was, I don't know, this sounds like I'm carrying on like I'm old. I'm not old. I'm 28. But I know when I was a teenager, women or females, girls didn't lift. We didn't go to the gym, or if we did, we were on a treadmill. I went to a sports school in high school, and it was always, if we did S&C in the gym, it was always, the girls would go stand on the Bosu ball and play around and be on the treadmill, and the boys would be lifting the weights. So I guess like I wasn't exposed to it until I was kind of forced into it. So I had a lot of injuries and a lot of surgeries when I was quite young. And so I was kind of forced into that regime quite early on to get exposure to it. And then it wasn't until later down the track where I decided to give it a go that I actually kind of fell in love with it. So it was probably accidental that I fell into weights and into strength sports. And to be honest, when I went to university, it was probably the first time, I was about 18 when I actually started going to a gym and like had a membership, and I'd go with my partner and we, I'd mimic him. I'd be like, oh, what are you doing? I'm going to join in. And it kind of went from there as like the exposure and the numbers get pretty addictive. So I guess early on, not necessarily. I think I was very invested in my endurance sports, in my mobility for my karate, and I was still running. So for me, going to the gym was a chore. At school, they kind of forced you in there, and I'd go stand on the treadmill. So I guess in terms of that, yeah, definitely not. Second part to that question, sum me up again.
Oh yeah. So I realized then I was thinking about when it came to mind, the being having a background in such a variety of sports and playing different, because you hear now of people who have been, so like a big example for probably over in the UK, Emily Campbell, obviously really successful, British weightlifter, had a background in athletics, and then obviously has gravitated towards the weightlifting side of things. Do you think having, played a variety of sports before, that background in sort of mobility, and maybe probably having an understanding of your own body coming into the strength sports was maybe a benefit, rather than, younger people now having an entry point into powerlifting and weightlifting kind of straight away, and that's the only sport that they do, rather than, I remember playing loads of variety of sports, and then it's only, over the last couple of years that I've been like, right, okay, I'm going to do powerlifting. I'm going to do powerlifting now. What are kind of your thoughts on that?
I kind of think there's a middle ground. Like, I think variety is super important when we're young. We want to develop, motor patterns, and we want to be good at a variety of things. You never want to specialize when you're really young. And I guess as a physio, you see kids who are very specialized end up, down the track with more likely of a chance to fall off because of, the pressure to be pushed so early. They get bored, they get injured because they're only strong through a certain motor pattern and through certain muscles. So I think it can be absolutely a detriment to be too specialized and fall straight into a sport and be expected to maintain over such a long period of time. To be completely honest, out of powerlifting and weightlifting, I don't know a lot of, for example, like youths or juniors who have become successful seniors. And you don't see that often because I just don't think people stick it out. It's a very long game to be just lifting a barbell in the same movements for 10 plus years. But you are really specialized and you are very technically efficient if you do that. Whereas I guess if you go the other way, and I guess for me, I feel like, I probably could have started a couple of years earlier and had a little bit more of a successful trajectory where, I've been weightlifting for 2 years and my technical efficiency is horrible. But in saying that, I could have definitely started earlier, but I probably wouldn't be as strong as what I am now or be as athletic as what I am now. So I think for me, even though I've only just recently jumped over to weightlifting, the powerlifting previously was really important for my strength foundation to now. Before then, even though there's not a whole lot of carryover with like karate and with running and all that, I think being competitive from such a young age has not only instilled the physical stuff, but it's instilled that mental, drive and that mental motivation, that fight. I think it's super important to have, that competitive mindset, and you build that from a young age, and that discipline and resilience to, I've got to train, this is my goal, this is competition. So I think for me, long term, starting with different sports earlier was important for my growth mentally, more so than probably physically. But I would say that it's absolutely helped. It's built a good foundation for me now.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, especially when you mentioned there about the competitive side of things, because from having, especially with the powerlifting and the weightlifting side of things, you said earlier on about chasing numbers, it becomes addictive, and I always say you kind of catch the powerlifting bug and be like, oh well, if I add this amount of kilos to my total, I can get this, which people enjoy, and I think people like the stats side of it. Whereas if you've never been exposed to other competitive elements, whatever that may be, I think sometimes it can be kind of a daunting, experience, going to your first powerlifting competition, because I always had the mentality of, playing rugby, it's 15 against 15 or 13 against 15, right? We're going to aim to beat you. Whereas in the kind of strength world, everyone wants everyone to see them do well. You want to, if people are going for a lift, it's kind of a different environment, still competitive, depending on the level, but it is a different environment. How did you find your first competition in powerlifting, and then now making the transition over to weightlifting? Were nerves both the same for two different strength sports, or how did you find that?
Oh, I probably have some recency bias with the weightlifting, to be honest. But I don't know. I mean, I started powerlifting competitively probably 6 years ago now. So I didn't powerlift for, in the big scheme of things, not too long. I was probably competitive powerlifting for 4 years before I made a transition. And I remember at the start of that, I mean, at the time I was nervous, and, I hated the thought. I think for women, it's always like, oh, I've got to wear that soft suit, or, oh, everyone's going to be looking at me, and I don't want to wear that. And, it's all those little things. It's not the bigger picture that you're worried about. And I think especially when you start off, you don't have that same pressure, because people don't know who you are, and they see you as a beginner, and that's a good thing, because there's no expectation. You're setting your own bar, and I enjoyed that a lot in powerlifting. And to be honest, I enjoyed that a lot with weightlifting, and just going to a new community where they didn't really know who I was, they didn't know my name, and it was nearly a clean slate. So for me, I think at the time it's always daunting when you're a beginner. You're thinking, everyone's watching, everyone expects me to not miss, and that's freaky. But as you go through your journey, you start to realize it actually probably gets scarier the longer you go, because those expectations and that bar is so high. But I think comparatively, sport to sport, I don't know why, but I always found powerlifting so much less daunting compared to weightlifting. And I think it was just because with powerlifting, I could always look down. Like, I didn't have to look at people. Like, I'd look at the ref's feet when I would squat and deadlift, and nothing would change. Weightlifting, I have to look up. So I remember my first weightlifting competition. I did it in a CrossFit gym where there were all the rigs in the background and people moving around. And I was really thrown off by it. I was just didn't know where to stare, wasn't used to picking a focal point, wasn't used to being forced to look up. And I found that really daunting. But between the two, they're so similar, and they're both strength sports. And I think as soon as you try not to, I guess, like, put the weight on your shoulders of other people's expectations, it does get a lot easier, because you just have more confidence in yourself, and to execute your plan, and everything goes well from there.
Yeah, I think that's. I never thought of it like that, especially because when you said looking down on powerlifting, you kind of think on bench press you're just looking up to the ceiling. Squat and deadlift, you can kind of not get anyone's eye. How did you? Was that quite a big adjustment then? Just I know I mentioned in the email, I might go off on a tangent, but in terms of the actual competition, did that take a little bit of a time to adjust? Because especially with the two lifts and the fact having to hold the bar, and all those sorts of things, did that take a little bit of a time to adjust? And did that maybe throw you off in terms of, because I know you'll watch because it was the British powerlifting championships over the weekend, and you watch the stream, and people will walk up to the bar, have the same routine, get yourself set, and then you can kind of switch off from everything. Whereas sometimes for weightlifting, the walkout is miles away, especially when I watch the Olympics and those sorts of things. How did it take in terms of the adjustment for that?
Yeah, I think like so it depends on the competitions, like for our local meets, that you don't have that big dramatic lead up. It's very similar to powerlifting. You're there at the chalk bowl, you walk out, you set up. The main difference would be that the looking down versus the looking up. And to be completely honest, I really struggled with it. I found it really daunting that I had to look up and look the refs in the eyes. I'm kind of like, they've just got this neutral face, and I just wasn't used to having to fix on that. And to be honest, it probably took me 2 or 3 competitions to have that not run through my head, where I'd turn up to the venue and I'd have to get myself on the platform before the event started and work out where I was going to look. And I'd have to turn just offset to the ref so I wasn't looking them dead in the eyes. And I'd really get anxious over that, the thought of going in, I'm going to have to stare this ref in the eyes. But I think after the third comp, once I become more confident with my lifts, and especially snatch, that first snatch, once I was confident with that went away, which was really nice. But I remember as a beginner with powerlifting too, you walk out and everyone's looking at you, and it freaks you the hell out when you know that there's just all eyes on you and you can't stuff it up. I guess the other thing with weightlifting, like you said, there is sometimes a nice big walkout, but I think for me, being a competitor for so long, you get really good at just like your mental approach to the bar, and it all becomes gray. You end up in that flow state where you don't remember that walk. You don't even remember doing the lift half the time. You sort of just, you're at the chalk bowl and then you're on the platform and then the weight's above your head. And you're like, oh, that's good. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, the more efficient you become in your lifting, the more you end up in that state of you're not thinking about it too much. It just sort of happens.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's it. Getting comfortable in that routine. It's similar to clients that I work with in the gym. Go through the same process. That's the whole reason why we do all these things, because it doesn't matter whether it's a bar on a platform on a competition or the bar in the gym.
Mm-hmm.
You approach it the same way. One thing that you mentioned there in terms of the mindset side of things, going onto the platform beforehand and going slightly off, was that something that you'd thought about before in terms of a mindset? Because it is that thing of how do you adjust to that? And sometimes because there's always that thought process of, there's some people who put some really big numbers up in training but can then sometimes struggle come competition with nerves or anything like that. Whereas, you mentioning the mindset side of things, was that something that you'd thought about before? Did you get told that from other people that you'd worked with, or, people that you surrounded yourself with, or was that something that you'd come to kind of yourself?
I think I really felt like I started getting really good at controlling my mindset and my mental approach to the bar probably like halfway through my powerlifting career. So probably when I became, part of the national team and I was doing more international, national and international meets, I felt like I was trying to invest more time into getting better at that, because I found that was a 2%er, right? Like, I mean, you get to a point as an elite athlete where you stop making those newbie gains, things start to plateau out, and you kind of just need a kilo or two sometimes on the day. And that mental approach is enough to get you over the edge there, especially if, for me, for example, in my powerlifting, deadlift was always my best lift by far. So if I did need to throw an extra kilo or two on that last deadlift, I needed to be ready. And that would be a big thing for me to win versus lose. So I mean, it's something I did a lot of reading about when I was into my powerlifting. I listened to a lot of podcasts, a lot of different athletes speaking about how they would get into their flow state. And it is such an individual thing. It's not something you just teach someone how to do. I think it comes when you feel like you can get in that zone, when you do feel 100% confident. You get a little bit of, I don't want to say like arrogance, but you are kind of like arrogance in yourself that you can do that. And, you're telling yourself that everyone's there to watch you nail it. And it gets to a point where you can visualize yourself doing the lift before you do it. And I always used to tell my clients, it sounds so bizarre and so silly being like, when you can visualize yourself successfully doing the lift, you've got it. And the amount of times I'd go to bed some nights when I wasn't ready for it and I'd see myself just fail. And no matter how much I could try and picture myself get it, it would always look shaky, or it would always look like a no lift. And, when you could finally get yourself, mentally to convince yourself that you can do it, as silly as it sounds, that makes a big difference. So I guess for me, with my powerlifting, I had my own routine, and eventually, every now and again, I'd somehow find myself in this flow state. And when I say flow state, I mean from where they call out your name to when I'm holding the bar and I get a down signal, I don't remember a thing. Like, it feels effortless and it just happens. And it doesn't happen often, but I found the more I could tap into that, the more, like, anything on that bar was going to move. It didn't matter what it was. But it is so hard to teach. And I don't think it's something you can teach. I think people just need to, if I were, to go back to me back then, I'd go back to my reading, listening to athletic podcasts, just trying to channel that and take it seriously. Yeah.
I completely understand, because I have conversations with clients and other coaches, and everyone kind of describes it in a different way, and you mentioned it like a flow state there. I completely get what you mean, whereas sometimes I think I agree, sometimes it is hard to teach that, even though you can go through, picture the lift, walk up to the bar, like what I said earlier in terms of having your routine with your bar. But sometimes it just takes time and experience, which is kind of, for people listening, might be like, oh, what? I can't just do that straight away. But it does take that. And for people who might have had a couple of competitions underneath the belt, like, it does happen. And then that way, you have a really good day, and then that's when you look back at the footage backwards and be like, oh, actually, there was a couple more kilos left on that platform. And, it goes back to what we said at the start of, you end up thinking, oh, well, if I'd have just hit this number, I could have got this total, and those sorts of things. One thing that I wanted to touch on there in terms of, listening to podcasts about mindset and, what other athletes do, I think it is a case of, in terms of the training side of things, there's a lot of information out there. And, in terms of training, what works. The mindset side of things, like what you said in terms of that 2%, I think is becoming more and more important, or a lot more people are tapping into the mindset side of things. And one question that I wanted to ask is, weightlifting had always been seen as the more professional sport, if you like. It was used in the strength and conditioning world for team sports and that sort of stuff. And powerlifting, let's eat what you want, go into your weight class and just lift. Whereas I think powerlifting is becoming a lot more professional, if you like. How have you found sort of the background in both of them from an athlete's point of view of how that sort of developed? And especially, over the last couple of years, powerlifting has kind of has blown up, especially, being raw. And like I say, the entry point has been a lot lower to get in. How have you found sort of the professionalism of both, if you like, at the higher level?
Yeah, I think when I started powerlifting, like, it was very, I don't know if I have a bias, because when I started, I wasn't elite or anything, but I know when I started, it was very, we're powerlifting because when you hit 9 for 9, you can go and eat a big greasy lunch after, it was like that, like, you've got to rock up to weigh in with the Krispy Kremes, scoff them before you lift, and then you get a greasy burger for lunch when you're done competing.
Have you been watching?
That's why you eat it.
Have you been to my competitions? That sounds a lot like how I would.
Seems like it's the pre-workout of every powerlifting competition. So I mean, like, not that was ever a bad thing, but it does take away from that sense of, like, well, that probably isn't great, pre-comp nutrition. Like, if your goal is to be trying to do the best you can, it seems a bit silly to be going and, eating that sort of thing beforehand. And it's something we all did when I started. I did it as well. And I guess that's something I see less and less of now in my competitions when I go to see people weigh in. Like, nutrition in the last 5 years, I know, especially with powerlifting, is taken a lot more seriously. So I guess that's been a big change that I've noticed, especially with the women here who compete. It's just ridiculous how strong they've gotten in the last 5 years and the competition. And it's not just the nutrition. I think when I started powerlifting, I think in Australia, it's probably hard worldwide for people to appreciate. We've had, every sport has politics, but we've had a lot of change of hands in federations here, and different federations run competitions differently. And I used to find, powerlifting Australia used to be very well run, very formal competitions where everything was done, on the minute, exactly how it's supposed to the book. And, then the new federation come out, and there were obviously, little bits and pieces that were a bit messy to start out. And now that things are, we've got the one federation that's affiliated with the IPF, it seems that things have ironed out really well. So at least from a perspective from Australia, it seems things run a lot more professionally now, that it's not muddy and there's not like, which federation is going to be best for me. And it's like, if you want to go to the IPF and you want to go to Worlds, this is where you need to be. Therefore, everything is run really professionally under this umbrella. And I think that's super important now, that everyone knows where they need to be to get where they need to go. And as I come out of powerlifting, there was that mud. Like, there were two federations. One was just currently kicked out of the IPF. The other still wasn't completely endorsed. And there was a really complex change of hands there, where it just all felt very unprofessional and very, just muddy, I would probably say it. Whereas now it's much clearer that now that there's one body in Australia, and I guess I haven't been internationally with powerlifting for a few years now because I haven't been in the sport, but looking as an outsider, it seems like things are a lot more clear, at least here anyway. Whereas for weightlifting, I don't have a whole lot to go off. I have only been doing it for competitively 20 months now. And at an international level, I mean, as far as my experience, everything has been professional. And I wouldn't complain about a thing with weightlifting. Yeah.
Oh, cool. And with making, you said there, competing in weightlifting for 20 months, are you kind of still finding challenges in terms of competing? Because we said at the start, they're still both strength sports. You're still putting more weight on the bar, whereas probably from a technical standpoint, there's a lot more to think about when it comes to weightlifting. This is where all the powerlifters start going, what do you mean there's more to think about in those lifts? But are you still kind of finding challenges as things are coming up through training and through the competitions that you've had, and what have been some of the biggest challenges in terms of transitioning over? Because I know you said at the start, having that base level of strength from powerlifting is a really big bonus. What were the main challenges that you found transitioning to weightlifting?
Yeah, there were a couple. Like, I think the big thing coming from powerlifting, and like anyone would, you're quite strong in the big three, squat, bench, dead. You can put some good weight on the bar for those lifts. And then all of a sudden, if you haven't done weightlifting before ever, and you have to then strip back to in some instances, a dowel, take 200 kilos off a bar and just go back to a dowel for a month. That can really hit the ego pretty hard and can be upsetting. So I know, like, to be honest, mentally, it took a really big hit to just let the ego go aside and go from being, the best in the country and deadlifting 210, that's great, to now, okay, you're going to work on a bar for the next month and we'll see how you're going from there. And just completely putting that aside and not being allowed to go do a bench press because it would affect my overhead mobility to make myself feel better, So I think the ego took a big hit. I was very strategic with the way I transitioned. Well, I'd like to think I was. In that, I guess there was a 6-month gap for me where I was still powerlifting. I knew I was going to go to weightlifting, but I would start to incorporate the basic strength weightlifting exercises into my program. So I would be putting in overhead squats for reps. I'd be putting in a lot of pause front squats with like a deep emphasis. I'd do a lot of push press, handstand push-up work. I was doing a lot of that, but still squat, benching and deadlifting as I was transitioning. And I felt that was really beneficial in me not losing too much strength in the transition while I was trying to learn the movements. And within that 6 months, I was also doing just empty bar work. So I was doing a lot of, getting used to a snatch and snatch pulls and clean pulls and a lot of those things. I think something that was really helpful that my coach did early on was, I guess from powerlifting, I was a sumo deadlifter, which was great because there was no confusion with my motor pattern when I had to go to a clean pull. Whereas any conventional deadlifting I was doing, we pulled that right out, just because I know myself and seeing others try and do super totals and things like that. It is super easy to confuse those two together and that motor pattern gets muddy. So I guess, there were strategies we used to try and make the transition as smooth as possible. But definitely coming from powerlifting, look, like the wrist mobility, the lat mobility would be the big one. Like, you come with big juicy lats from powerlifting and then you press out everything above your head because you just don't have the mobility. So it was good, I think, that we had those movements in early on while we were transitioning to get comfortable there.
I think from that point of view, because I think sometimes you can just think oh, well, you can squat and deadlift as a power lifter, that'll be fine for a weightlifter. Whereas, you mentioned a couple of things there of, just doing some overhead squats, just doing some handstand push-ups, just trying to add some things, because I think there are some similarities that you can have. But like what you mentioned there about the conventional and the sumo, there are like what we've said, they are both strength sports, but they are going to be very different. In terms of the build up to competitions, did you find anything different in terms of the strategy, in terms of peaking up to the well, probably more so on how your body feels, because only having two lifts heading into a competition, was it kind of a little bit of, oh, actually this feels pretty good only doing two lifts into a competition, compared to, I know sometimes I've been into competitions just thinking I can't wait to compete, and then just have a little bit of time off. Was there any difference there, or was it pretty similar heading into sort of your peaking phase heading into the competition?
Oh, super different, and in a good way different. I remember like powerlifting comps, everyone who powerlifts would appreciate, you wait for that taper, and then, in that taper week, everything feels like crap, and, your neural system is just cooked, and, you're just exhausted. And even like your week's work of the week leading up to a comp, you're just fried, and, you're just mentally like, oh, I just need to get this done. And then miraculously you wake up on comp day and everything's fantastic. But I remember powerlifting, I used to, like, it would happen every competition. I would do a 10-day taper for competition, where we'd progressively drop my volumes over 10 days slowly down to 40%, and then back up to 60% day before comp. And that was just what worked for me. And that drop, like, I used to like think, this deadlift is like 20 kilos under my opener and it's not even breaking the floor, and I've got to compete in 7 days. Holy shit. But then you'd go and PB on comp day and everything would be fine. Whereas weightlifting, I just think, because for me anyway, the loads that I'm lifting aren't nearly as heavy as what they were for powerlifting. My recovery turnaround is just like so fast. Like when my weightlifting now, I'm probably nearly maxing out, every week, like every Friday is like my max out Friday, and, and I can still go in and lift pretty heavy on Saturday and not be too affected, just because, the heaviest thing I'd be doing would be a clean, and, that would be maybe 100 kilos for me. Whereas, I can front squat 130. So that, in comparison, for a couple of reps isn't exhausting or isn't taxing, as it might be for someone who doesn't have that strength or that background with powerlifting. So I think in terms of the lead up to a competition, weightlifting has been lovely, and I would find it very hard to transition back to powerlifting after how I've been feeling both physically and mentally, but very different. And the tapers are obviously much shorter for weightlifting for me.
Do you think that recovery will change? Obviously, the more you progress in weightlifting, and the more the weights go up. Do you think that's because, I know we touched on sort of the newbie gains? I think that might be more of a skill component in terms of as that's developing. Do you think that might change? Or one thing that I wanted to touch on, especially working as a physio and understanding your body and mobility and the recovery side of things, or do you reckon that's kind of what's the phrase I'm looking for, kind of like in your advantage, so that you can always keep on top of those things?
I would like to think it's in my advantage. I'd like to think that, as I progress, like, my body does adapt and it does adjust. I don't think it would ever feel like it did when I was powerlifting, just not lifting enough load. But I would like to think, yeah, my body would adjust as time goes. And to be honest, I'm kind of at a point where I don't see myself lifting so much more that it would impact me too much more. I think we made some great newbie gains early on, and between then and now, not much has changed. So I just think, yeah, in terms of total volumes and working that out, the taper might start a little earlier, but in terms of how I feel, I think I would imagine it would stay pretty consistent.
Yeah, and a couple of times, obviously, you mentioned swapping powerlifting to weightlifting and the mobility side of things. And you mentioned starting in strength sports from injuries. On the physio side of things, do you think that's kind of helped you have a better understanding when you're working with clients in terms of because there's sometimes probably more so in the strength sport side of things, oh, it's fine, I'll still be able to do this session or anything like that. Has that kind of helped you in terms of your approach, how you work with clients, and an understanding of that people want to go back and lift, whereas actually you could sometimes cause more damage just diving straight back in, rather than, right, this is the process of getting back to full fitness and full strength?
I think being a therapist is awesome because it helps me, rather than just know what to tell people, I think it's helped me empathize with people a lot better. So I can appreciate, you might need to unload for 2 weeks, and I don't want you squatting heavy, but at least I can work with the athlete in methods how we can still train and how we can still keep moving, somehow to make it work, and empathize, what they would be going through mentally. Like right now, I had a pretty bad injury about 2 weeks ago that I'm trying to rehab right now. I completely tore my quad off the tendon, just completely ruptured it. And if I were, me going through that is super important as a therapist, because, I get patients all the time who have to have months off, and it's, not ever, you don't want to be the person that's like, you're going to have to not clean and jerk for 3 months. People are going to be like, what the hell? I've got Com Games coming up. I need to do it. But at least, me going through that, I have my own strategies that I've implemented. I kind of know how it feels, not just physically, but mentally. But I can help them sort of, plan through what they are going to do for the next 3 months, whether it be a completely different strategy that helps them still move to some capacity, or whether it be just mentally, we find something else for them to fill that gap that they're missing, that piece to their life that makes such a big contribution. So I think as a therapist, not that I want to go and get injured, and I definitely wouldn't encourage that. It's awesome that, I can share that with people, and, I don't want to say to people like, I know what you're going through, but I can help at least try and understand what they're going through, and provide alternate strategies. Because I don't think I've ever had to tell anyone, who's coming with an injury, do not go to the gym and train. There's always something that they can do, always. So I think that's super important.
Yeah, definitely. Because I know sometimes, I've had clients come back and say, "Oh yeah, I went and saw a physio, and they said, oh, I need to not do anything for 3 weeks," and it's kind of like, well, surely there's something that we can focus on, because it's a little bit like, earlier on when we were speaking about the mindset side of things. People need to still feel as though they're progressing, whereas there might be other things that start coming to the surface if they don't end up training. In terms of we've spoken about the mobility side of things, and I know when we were setting up this chat, I was talking about sort of the prehab and then the rehab side of things. Was that a conversation that you've had with the coaches that you've worked with in terms of adding stuff in? Have you had any influence on that, or was it a case of you kind of kept them quite separate? Your own training and the clients that you work with.
Yeah, so I think for me personally, I implement my own stuff only because I feel really confident in what I feel I need. And my coach is a good friend of mine. So I think for him, I let him handle like the barbell stuff and the gym stuff, and he knows that I know my body better than anyone else. Just over the years, knowing what I feel good doing, and how I feel on the day. So for me, I manage my own little routine of things depending on how I feel that morning or what I'm training. How I usually work with my clients, and I think, it's really tricky when you're a physio who looks after, especially like I specialize with lifters, you don't want to tread on a coach's toes, right? So I don't want to go and construct a warm-up program for someone who's already got one from their coach, and then they're doubling up, and then they're probably doing things that their coach doesn't know about or should know about and might not want them doing, or it might be, contradicting something. So for me, it's super important to be just communication focused. I would always reach out to a coach if it is someone else's client and say, I've assessed, this person today. These are the things that I've noticed. Have you noticed this? Would you be happy for me to either give them some guidance, or could you potentially add this somewhere into their warm-up program? And I think it's super important for, I know powerlifters, for example, when I was a powerlifter, we'd spend hours in the gym. Like 2 hours would be pretty normal. And I would like to think I didn't rest lots. I know people spend longer than that. And the last thing they want to hear is, oh, here's half an hour of rehab. You've got 20 minutes from the physio, 20 minutes from the coach, and then get under a bar. So I think just for buy-in's sake as well, you need to keep it short and sweet. And there's nothing better than when a team works together and you just get the better results out of people that way.
Yeah, and I think that's mentioning there, working as a team, and that's why I kind of asked between, do you keep it quite separate, or can you blend the two together? Because I know sometimes, exactly like what you said there, you've got your program from your coach, and then you're going to have, some rehab or prehab that you need to do, and it's kind of like, how do I blend this together? Because I always liken that. I think it's a photograph where the person stood on the podium and there's all the other things underneath that they've had to do, and I think it has to be a teamwork side of things. Do you think that that's becoming more and more? I know we touched on it earlier about the professionalism side of things, but do you think that's becoming more and more apparent? Where because I've worked with some therapists and physios who haven't trained, that haven't got that background, and they don't have that understanding. Do you think that's kind of changing now? What's kind of your thoughts on that?
I think it's changed heaps. Like I know when I started, oh God, I'm only new to physiotherapy. So I've been practicing for 2 years now. But I know when I was a lifter, when I was starting out 6 years ago, I couldn't find a physio that was barbell lifting, like nowhere, like in Sydney, which is quite big, let alone in Australia. So I think now, you go on Instagram and there's knee physios, there's powerlifting physios, there's these physios. And I think social media has been glamorous in that. Like it's been able to, provide all of these alternatives for people who specialize in different sports and different movements. And I think the beauty in social media is not only the market for that, but it allows us as therapists to easily reach out to those coaches. So I see a lot of online people like from America, from New Zealand, in just like interstate Australia. And, if I want to send a quick voice message to a coach and say, hey, like introduce myself, say that I've seen their client and, just sort of point it out. These are some, they've come to me with knee pain. These are some things I've noticed. Would you be happy for me to send you some recommendations on like what they could do? And usually like 99% of the time, the coaches are happy as Larry, because not only are we addressing the person's pain, that means they can keep training. That keeps not only the coach in business, but it keeps the athlete happy. And it's a win-win because they perform on the platform. So I think the athlete gets what they want because they're not in pain anymore and they can lift well. And the coach and the therapist are happy because we kind of make each other's jobs easier. Because the coach has that connection with the athlete. They know them really well. They might know some social yellow flag things that may or may not be happening that I've missed. And that might help me in terms of diagnosing and prescribing. And I have that feel like in what I'm looking for. So I think as a team, it's really easy to do this day and age because you can literally pick up your phone, go on Instagram, pop in their name, and I can just shoot them a voice message from the other side of the world and that patient's looked after. So I think in terms of that wouldn't have happened 5 years ago, whereas it happens, I don't know about anywhere else in the world, but it happens a lot here in Australia. And I think it's awesome that people have that communication bias like together. And to be honest, I don't hear a lot of patients anymore come to me and say, I went and saw this physio, but he doesn't lift and he told me not to go to the gym anymore. That happens so rarely now compared to when I was a lifter and everyone would say that, my physio said not to train. I think that's super rare this day and age.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's been a change for the good, really. And I know obviously really interesting hearing you mention that about, especially on the social media side of things. I said earlier, type in powerlifting and loads of things will come up, and I think sometimes it can be quite hard to filter what's actually useful on social media because there is so much information on there. Whereas in terms of like what you mentioned there, sending a voice note communication, me contacting you from all the way over here in Leeds, it is only going to be beneficial. And you hit the nail on the head there. Ultimately, it's about that athlete, that client getting on the platform, and because everyone gets involved in strength sports. I say this quite a lot. Everyone gets involved in strength sports because they enjoy it or they catch that powerlifting or weightlifting bug, and to be able to stop that sort of oh well, I'm the coach, so I'm now going to step into the physio world, and I'm gonna try and fix them. It's kind of, you know, much better to have somebody who's an expert and got a knowledge in that field, rather than, especially with the physios and therapists that I work with. You know, I would never try and have that knowledge up to a certain point, but then it's, you know, with help, I always use the analogy of, if you broke your car, I wouldn't try and fix that myself. I have an understanding, but you would go see you would go see a mechanic.
And I think it goes both ways too, though, right? Like, I think I see still a lot of therapists this day and age who get a bit carried away, even as physios, you know, and it can be sometimes really easy for us to step on toes without realizing, you know, and we give a bunch of things, and we off the cuff might go, you know, oh, you know, if I were you, I'd probably be doing some box squats, or I'd be doing this. And then before you know it, you know, that athlete's gone back to the coach and said, why aren't you putting these in my program? And then it sounds like, you know, the coach has missed something, and then they get annoyed. And you've got to be super careful and just be both so switched on with transparency and with communication that absolutely, like, yeah, the coach can sometimes think they can do the job, but I think sometimes the physios can do it too, and that's where the communication can't go wrong.
Yeah, definitely. It's got to be like that, you know. Especially, I've had a couple of people work with coaches on their nutrition as well, you know, and it's a case of, right, well, this is their training, this is, and then you can match everything up. So yeah, I think communication is a really big thing, and you know, it's good to hear that you know, from what I've seen, and you know, from yourself as well, that that is getting better and changing slightly. Quite a lot of topics chatted about there, and a few tangents thrown in. The last question that I like to ask for everyone listening: what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom?
Words of wisdom. Oh man, in terms of from an athlete perspective?
Whatever you want, from an athlete's perspective, physio perspective.
All right. Well, I guess, like, if it were from me from an athlete perspective, or even a work perspective, you know, I think if your ultimate goal is to want to, you know what, if I'm going to give like one little tip that I've noticed that like a lot of people in Australia in recent times have like taken upon, it's don't be afraid to try something new. I think with powerlifting, when I started, you feel like you nearly get sucked into this tunnel of like, you know, I'm starting to get good at this sport and I need to just stay here now, and I can't do something different because this is my identity and this is what I've got to do. And, you know, I'm deadlifting or squatting this much, so I can't go do weightlifting because I'd have to start from scratch. I just think, you know, don't be afraid to try different things, and don't get too caught up on what you think other people are thinking of you, because 90% of the time people aren't thinking anything of you, and if anything, they're admiring you giving things a go. So something I don't regret is that transition. I've absolutely loved going from powerlifting to weightlifting. I would never, you know, redo it another way. And if I didn't let myself be a bit vulnerable for, you know, 12 months to make that transition, it wouldn't have happened. So I think if you are looking for a bit of a change in whatever sport someone's trying to do, and they're worried about what others think, just give it a crack, because I don't think you're really going to regret it if you're having that itch to want to make a change.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to finish on. And you know, you're kind of, especially, you know, when we've been speaking about powerlifting and weightlifting, there you can see that you enjoy weightlifting. Do you know what I mean? You've enjoyed that transition, which is really good. And I think that's a really good example that people will put themselves in that box of, well, I'm a powerlifter, so I can't do anything else. I just need to lift heavy all the time, or I'm a CrossFitter, or whatever it is. Whereas, you know, actually, similar to like what we said at the very start, well, actually, I did karate, I did rugby league, rugby union. You know, there's no reason to go and do these different things. I know for me, after the British Championships last year, I kind of I didn't have that excitement to lift. It was the first time after a powerlifting competition. I was kind of like, I remember walking into the gym, loading up to deadlift, and just thought, I don't really fancy doing this. So I went back and played rugby for a little bit, just to do something different. And I think that's where, you know, it's okay to do that. Powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, CrossFit, rugby are always going to be there. You can dip in and out of it. It's not to say that you have to do that all the time. Thanks a lot, Jess, for taking the time to jump on. Really, really enjoyed chatting with you this morning or this evening. for anyone listening who might have any questions about what we've chatted about today, want to see the content and info that you put out there, where could people find you or reach out to you?
Yeah, cool. So first of all, thanks for having me, Stephen. It's been awesome to have a chat. And like I said, you're catching me sort of as it's starting to darken up. So it's kind of probably good timing. I'm Sewa Strong on Instagram. So Sewa SEWA Strong. So yeah, if you guys want to reach out, feel free to ask questions. I'm quite responsive. So happy to answer any questions to do with anything at all, even if it is about you know, making a little sneaky transition. I'm more than happy to give some context behind my journey. And I guess, yeah, in terms of posts, I've been pretty bad educational wise, but I'll usually pop up the odd physio thing here and there. So performance wise, injury wise, yeah, give me a message if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jess, for taking the time to jump on. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.
Thanks, Stephen.